first snow of November drifted sideways across the meadow in pale sheets, catching on the split rail fence and frozen grass until the veterans' retreat looked softened. Porch lights came on early. They glowed against the lodge windows while the mountains beyond stood blue and silent. Daniel Mercer stood near the outer rehabilitation fence, watching the tree line as if he had been called there by something he could not hear. He was 52, broad-shouldered but thinner than people remembered, with silver atmote fey his temples and a careful way of turning his head when someone spoke. After the blast overseas had taken most of his hearing, the world reached him through movement now. Lips, hands, vibration, light. Behind him, staff moved gently around the lodge. A nurse arranged mugs beside the coffee urn. A young veteran laughed, then lowered his voice when Daniel did not turn. His sister Elise stood on the porch steps, holding a paper cup Vicepite hat both hands, pretending she had only come out for air. But Daniel knew worry when he saw it. Worry had a posture. 4 years had passed since anyone had seen Juniper. No one had said her name when they arrived that morning. They had been careful, the way families became careful around old bruises. The land itself had remembered, though. The same pines leaned against the same crooked fence. The same gate clicked in the wind. The same juniper bushes grew near the ravine, silver green and stubborn, still holding snow inside their branches. Daniel had tried not to look there. He had come because Elise had asked, and because the retreat for deaf and hard of hearing veterans had invited him. Dr. Klein, the veterinarian who still worked the property, had promised safer fencing, better shelters, and people who understood distance. He had come because saying no had begun to feel like another kind of hiding. If this quiet story touched someone listening, a gentle like or subscription could help it travel. The community would be glad to know where they were watching from and what animal marked their heart. Daniel did not speak much at gatherings. Words had become tiring after the hearing loss, because every conversation asked him to work twice as hard to reach the same shore. He carried a small notebook in his coat, with a bent cover and a pencil tucked in the spiral. Elise joked that he trusted that pencil more than most people. He did. That afternoon, the pencil was beside a folded blue cloth square in his pocket. It was only a torn corner of an old blanket, washed thin, the color of sky after rain. He had never told Elise. Near the fence, a chickadee hopped along the top rail, shook snow from its feathers, and scolded the cold with bright jerks of its head. Daniel almost smiled. Then the meadow changed. It was not a sound. Daniel would not have heard it if there had been one. It was the sudden attention of the people behind him, the way bodies stilled before minds understood why. Elise Escup stopped halfway to her mouth. Doctor. Klein froze near the clinic gate. The young veteran lowered his phone. Daniel followed their eyes. At the far edge of the ravine, between the juniper bushes and a fallen cottonwood, a bobcat stood in the snow. She was not close. She was only a shape at first, low and muscular, tawny gray against the brush. Her winter coat had thickened around her cheeks. One ear held a familiar notch near the tip. Her left whisker line was uneven, where old scar tissue pulled the fur slightly pale. Her amber eyes carried that same watchful steadiness Daniel had seen in dreams he never admitted having. Juniper. The name passed through him without sound. She did not come running. A bobcat would not. She stood with one front paw lifted, testing the air. Her short tail twitched once, black tip flicking like a small question. Then she lowered her paw and angled her head. Daniel's breath left him slowly. Elise stepped down from the porch, then stopped herself, one hand near her mouth. "Doctor." Klein raised her palm, warning everyone to stay still. She did not have to warn Daniel. He could not have moved if the ground had asked him to. For 4 years, he had imagined Juniper slipping through spring grass, lying on summer stone, crossing autumn roads at dusk. In winter, when the cold came hard, he tried not to imagine too much. Now she stood in front of him, real enough for snow to gather on her back. A small, foolish thought came first. She still hated deep snow. When she had been young, she would step high through drifts with offended dignity, shaking each paw as though the mountain had insulted her. Daniel had once cleared a narrow path beside the enclosure and pretended it was for firewood, while Dr. Klein pretended not to notice. Juniper had used only half the path because she preferred improving human work by ignoring it. The memory warmed him so quickly that it hurt. The Bobcat took one step forward, then another, not toward the crowd, toward him. Daniel slowly pulled his hands from his pockets, empty palms open, fingers relaxed. He had done that 100 times long ago. No reaching, no grabbing, no claim, only an offer of stillness. Juniper stopped. Her ears shifted. Her nose lifted into the wind. The snow carried pine sap, wet wool, cooling coffee, and the clean metal smell of the clinic gate. Somewhere under all of it was Daniel's familiar trace, older, now, changed by time and sorrow, but still threaded with cedar soap, leather gloves, and the quiet man who had once sat outside her pen for hours, without asking anything from her. Daniel felt his throat tighten. He had learned not to expect wild things to stay. He had learned it from war, from silence, from the empty blue blanket. But he had never learned how to stop loving Ve Kephat. Ate had gone back to the trees. Juniper lowered her paw into the snow, watching him. Daniel made one small motion with his right hand, a sign Elise had taught him years before. Stay. Maybe Juniper remembered only the rhythm of him. Maybe memory, for a wild creature, was not a story but a scent, a shape, a safe distance once honored. Then her eyes softened in a way no one else might have noticed. She blinked once, slow and deliberate, and took another step through the falling snow. Before the fence, before the retreat, before Juniper became a name his family spoke softly, Daniel Mercer had lived alone at the end of Tamarack Ridge Road, where the county plow came late and the mailbox leaned, as if it had grown tired of holding up winter. His cabin sat beneath a shoulder of lodgepole pine in northern Montana, not far from the old logging trails that climbed toward Cabinet Mountain. It had one bedroom, a narrow kitchen, a wood stove with a stubborn door, and a porch step that dipped on the left, because Daniel kept meaning to fix it and kept choosing other things first. In the mornings, frost silvered the window panes so thickly that sunlight entered the room in broken pieces. He rose before dawn because sleep had never fully trusted him after the war. Some nights ended with him sitting at the kitchen table, one hand around a chipped brown mug, feeling the refrigerator hum through the floorboards more than hearing it. The hearing aids lay beside the salt shaker most mornings, small and beige and accusing. He wore them in town when he had to. At home, he let the world be quiet. Quiet did not mean peaceful at first. It meant missing the kettle's whistle until steam fogged the window, It meant not knowing when a truck turned into the drive, unless he saw headlights sweep the wall. It meant feeling left behind by conversations that moved too quickly across other people's mouths. It meant Elise tapping his shoulder gently, then looking sorry when he flinched. His sister lived 40 minutes away in Libyve, kept her husband and 2 boys, but she came up every Thursday with groceries. Daniel pretended he did not need. She always brought too many oranges. He always arranged them in a wooden bowl, as if she had made a reasonable choice. Once, when she slipped a packet of fancy tea into his cupboard, he labeled it grass clippings in his notebook, and she laughed so hard she had to sit down on the porch rail. Those little jokes kept them from speaking too directly about harder things. Before the injury, Daniel had been a mechanic in the army, the kind of man who could listen to an engine and know which bolt had begun to lie. Afterward, machines still made sense, but people became difficult. He worked part-time, repairing snowmobiles and old ranch trucks in a shed beside the cabin, where tools hung in careful rows and every drawer was labeled in black marker. Neighbors trusted him because he was fair. They did not always know whether he had understood them until he answered with the exact wrench they needed. He carried a pencil behind his ear and wiped his hands on the same faded green rag. He touched doorframes when entering rooms, not for superstition, but to feel where he was. At night, he checked the latch twice, then stood on the porch and watched the tree line until the darkness stopped moving. The land around his cabin was not empty. It only refused to announce itself. Snowshoe hares stitched nervous tracks beneath the currant bushes. Ravens strutted along the shed roof like inspectors. Mule deer came down in blue twilight and stood so still among the aspens that they seemed made of breath. Once, in the mud near the creek, Daniel found a round paw print with no claw marks and a neat private confidence to it. Bobcat. Ranger May Collins wrote in his notebook when she stopped by later that week to pick up a repaired chainsaw. Daniel had stared at the print for a long while after she left. A bobcat moved differently than the animals that crowded human edges. It did not scatter like rabbits or graze like deer. It placed itself where it chose, silent and self-contained, and left only enough evidence to remind the world it had never asked permission. Something about that stayed with him. He had not been lonely in a simple way. He did not keep a note noise for the sake of noise or company that filled a room until he had nowhere to breathe. What he missed was being understood without effort. In the service, his crew had known his gestures across a motor pool. A raised eyebrow meant the part was wrong. 2 fingers toward the ground meant set it there. A flat palm meant wait. After the blast, those gestures remained, but the men who knew them were scattered across states, hospitals, and graves. So Daniel taught his hands to speak again. He learned sign language slowly through classes at the Veterans Clinic in Kalispell, driving there twice a month when the roads were clear. He practiced at the kitchen table with a printed chart weighted under his mug. His fingers were stiff, and some signs looked clumsy at first, as if his hands had become tools borrowed from someone else. Elise learned with him. Her boys learned faster and used signs for cookies, bathroom, and dinosaur long before they could remember please. Warmth entered the cabin in those small, sideways ways. His youngest nephew, Milo, once taped paper ears to Daniel's hearing aids and called them Uncle Antennas. Elise scolded him for 3 seconds before smiling into the sink. A neighbor named Walt paid for a brake repair with a sack of huckleberries and 1 deeply offended chicken that escaped from the truck bed and had to be carried home under Daniel's arm. Even the wood stove seemed to soften on certain evenings, giving up its heat without making him fight the iron handle. But some mornings, after visitors left and tire tracks hardened in the snow, the cabin felt like a held breath. Daniel would stand at the window, mug in hand, watching the ridge turn gold. He never said he was waiting for anything. Waiting sounded too hopeful. He told himself he was only observing weather, checking for fallen limbs, watching for deer. Still, his eyes often returned to the creek path, where the bobcat print had dried and vanished. He had learned how Mo'u-she-hat could disappear without making a sound. Long before he saw juniper beneath the culvert, the mountain had already been teaching him that silence was not emptiness. It was where the most careful lives passed through, leaving faint marks for anyone patient enough to notice. The first time Daniel saw her, the sky had been the color of old tin, and the road down from Tamarack Ridge had worn a skin of black ice so thin it looked like water. He had been driving home from Libby with a box of spark plugs on the passenger seat and Elise oranges rolling in a paper bag by his boots. The heater in the truck worked only when it felt respected, so his breath kept clouding the windshield at the corners. Snow had not yet begun in earnest, but the air had that sharp waiting smell before a mountain storm, all wet stone, pine pitch, and cold metal. Daniel drove slowly, because dusk made roadside animals bold and foolish. He watched for deer eyes near the ditch and the sudden pale flash of rabbits. He did not hear the creek running under the culvert, but he felt the road change where the water passed beneath it, a slight tremble through the steering wheel. Then he saw the crows. 3 of them stood on the guardrail ahead, hunched and glossy, shifting with the impatient manners of creatures expecting a meal. One hopped toward the ditch and flapped back up again. Another tilted its head, black eye fixed below the road. Daniel eased the truck onto the shoulder. He sat for a moment with both hands on the wheel. Trouble in winter often looked small at first. A torn feed sack, a bundle of weeds, a shadow where a shadow should not be. He opened the door and stepped into air so cold it entered his sleeves. Gravel shifted under his boots. The crows lifted in offended silence from his world, though he saw their wings beat hard against the gray sky. He took the flashlight from behind the seat, tapped it once until the beam steadied, and moved toward the ditch. At first, he saw only storm water pooled beneath the culvert mouth, brown with leaves and rimmed by brittle ice. Then the shape inside the weeds moved. 2 amber eyes opened. Daniel stopped. A young bobcat crouched half under the lip of the culvert, pressed tight against the concrete, as if she could become part of it. She was small, not a kitten but not fully grown. Her winter coat muddied dark along one side. Burrs clung beneath her chin. One ear lay lower than the other, and a pale scrape marked the left side of her muzzle near the whiskers. She held one front pay-a-vey kep slightly off the ground. She did not cry out. She did not plead. Her mouth opened just enough to show the edge of small white teeth, and the warning in her face was clear as a spoken sentence. Stay back. Daniel obeyed. He lowered himself slowly onto one knee in the gravel, far enough that the flashlight did not strike her eyes directly. His injured hearing made the roadside eerily calm, but his body understood danger in other ways. The bobcat's shoulders bunched. Her whiskers stiffened. Her pupils widened in the fading light. She was frightened enough to strike and weak enough to fail. That was the part that moved him. He had known that feeling once, waking in a hospital bed, with strangers leaning over him, every instinct shouting to fight while his body refused to answer properly. He remembered the humiliation of needing help from people whose words arrived as shapeless movement. He remembered wanting everyone to step back and wanting someone to stay, both at the same time. Daniel took off his right glove and opened his palm on his knee. Empty. The bobcat stared at his hand. A truck passed on the road behind him, tires whispering over ice. Its headlights swept the ditch and painted the culvert gold for one brief second. The Bobcat flattened herself, ears back, paw lifted higher. Daniel waited until the light moved away. In his coat pocket, his phone vibrated with a message he almost missed. Elise, probably asking whether he had remembered the oranges. She had started sending questions that required only yes or no. Are you alive? Did you eat? Is the truck making that stupid noise again? A small warmth passed through him despite the cold. He texted with clumsy thumbs, injured Bobcat near culvert, calling May. Then he called Ranger May Collins. He could not understand her well over the phone, even with the volume high, so he used the speech-to-text screen and watched her words appear in broken lines. Stay back. Do not touch. Motluklunk call doctor. Klein. Can you mark location? Keep traffic away if safe. Daniel placed an orange from Elise S. bag on the guardrail, not because it helped, but because he needed something bright and visible to mark the spot. The absurdity of it might have made him laugh on another evening. One veteran, one wounded Bobcat, one heroic orange standing watch in Montana dusk. The Bobcat watched the orange too, deeply suspicious of citrus. You and me both, Daniel murmured, though he barely heard himself. He backed up to the truck and found a wool blanket behind the seat, blue and patched where Elise had mended it after Milo spilled cocoa. He did not approach the animal with it. Instead, he set it folded on the gravel, several feet from the culvert, weighted one edge with a stone, and retreated again. The Bobcat's nose twitched. She sniffed once toward the blanket, then looked away with magnificent disdain. As if blankets were a human weakness she had no intention of encouraging. A burr under her chin bobbed when she swallowed. Her lifted paw trembled once before she steadied it. Snow began as tiny hard grains clicking against Daniel's coat. He could not hear them, but he saw them bounce from his sleeve and gather on the flashlight lens. He stood between the bend in the road and the culvert, waving passing vehicles wider with slow, clear motions. One driver, Walt from the lower ranch, rolled down his window and shouted something Daniel did not catch. Daniel pointed to the ditch and signed Wildcat without thinking. Walt blinked, looked, and immediately rolled his window back up. That almost made Daniel smile. When Ranger May's truck finally came around the bend, red light washing over the icy road, Daniel felt relief loosen his shoulders. Doctor. Klein arrived behind her with a carrier, thick gloves, and the kind of calm that did not crowd a frightened creature. Daniel stepped back. The Bobcat did not take her eyes from him. Doctor. Klein did not let Daniel help with the capture, and later he was grateful for that. At the roadside, he had stood back near the orange while May and the veterinarian worked veikeptique, careful patience. The Bobcat had struck once at the padded board, with a speed that made Walt whisper behind his truck window. Even weakened, she was lightning folded into fur. Her warning was clean, fierce, and honest. When the carrier door finally closed, Daniel saw her crouched inside, muddy chest rising and falling, amber eyes fixed on every human, as if she were memorizing who had stolen the night from her. She go to the rehab enclosure, doctor. Klein had told him slowly, facing him so he could read her lips. No handling unless needed. No taming. She gets a chance. not a cage life. Daniel nodded. That mattered. By the next afternoon, snow had covered the road and softened the ditches until the culvert looked innocent. Daniel drove to Dr. Klein's small wildlife clinic with a box of old towels, 2 extension cords she had asked for, and Elisis oranges, because he forgot they were still in the truck. The clinic sat behind her house on a few fenced acres, where owls, foxes, and a suspicious porcupine waited among pines. The air smelled of straw, disinfectant, cold iron, and the faint, clean musk of wild animals. Daniel felt the low thump of a washing machine through the floor when he stepped inside. On a counter, a coffee maker sputtered beside a jar of dog biscuits labeled "Not for Patients." Someone had drawn an angry raccoon on the label. Dr. Klein accepted the towels, looked at the oranges, and raised one eyebrow. For morale, Daniel wrote in his notebook. For whose? She wrote back. He almost smiled. The Bobcat had a bruised shoulder, a strained foreleg, and no broken bones. She was thin beneath her winter coat, full of burrs, and far too alert to be considered helpless. Dr. Klein had given her fluids, warmth, and a quiet enclosure at the back of the property where human traffic stayed low. The pen had a wooden den box, a climbing shelf, evergreen branches, and enough shadow for an animal to believe she could disappear. Daniel saw her only through a narrow observation slit the first week. She pressed herself into the darkest corner of the den box and watched with one visible eye. The pale mark on her left muzzle had dried into a little crescent, making her look older than she was. One ear showed a tiny notch at the tip, likely from some earlier scrape in the woods. Her front paw rested lightly, never fully trusted. She needs quiet, Doctor, Klein told him. Daniel understood quiet. So he came after repairs, never at feeding time unless Dr. Klein asked, never close enough to make the Bobcat feel cornered. He fixed a warped latch on the supply shed. He patched a loose board near the fox pen. He replaced the broken porch bulb outside the clinic door, because the old one flickered so badly it made reading lips impossible. Each time, before leaving, he stood 3 feet from the outer fence of the Bobcat enclosure. Not 2. Not leaning in. 3. He learned the distance because Dr. Klein marked it with a flat stone half buried in snow. The first rule was simple. Let the wild thing have the choice to ignore you. For many days, the Bobcat chose exactly that. She turned her back to him with exquisite contempt. She tucked her paws beneath her body and faced the den wall. Once, when Daniel shifted his weight and the bad porch step creaked under him outside the clinic, she flicked her ear without turning around, as if cataloging yet another disappointing human noise. Another morning, she dragged a spruce branch across the enclosure and placed it directly between herself and the observation slit. Dr. Klein called it environmental preference. May called it attitude. Daniel called it fair. He brought no speeches. He did not whistle, click, or coax. He sat on an overturned feed bucket outside the fence with his notebook on his knee, breath clouding in front of him, hands visible and still. Sometimes he copied sign language drills. Sometimes he wrote grocery lists. Elise would later amend with dramatic disapproval. Once he sketched the Bobcat's notch-eared silhouette so badly that Dr. Klein glanced at, mote fit, and wrote, "That looks like a potato with feet." Daniel wrote back, "It moved too fast." It had not moved at all. Small warmth gathered in those routines before anyone admitted it. The porcupine began waddling to the front of his pen whenever Daniel arrived, expecting apple slices Daniel was not supposed to provide. Dr. Klein's old clinic cat Amos sat in the window and glared at Daniel as though veterans' vey capite hat toolboxes were a threat to civilization. Elise started sending texts that said, "How is your angry shadow?" And Daniel found himself answering more than yes or no. The Bobcat noticed all of it. She noticed his boots first. That was what Dr. Klein believed. Daniel's right boot scuffed slightly because of an old hip injury, making a faint drag in the snow. He could not hear it, but he saw the line it left. After a week, the Bobcat's ears began to angle toward him before he reached the flat stone. After 2 weeks, she stopped retreating into the den box every time he appeared. After 3, she stayed on the climbing shelf, chin lifted, watching him through falling flakes. It was not trust. Not yet. It was only the beginning of believing he might be boring enough to survive. Daniel found comfort in that. He had spent years feeling people wanted him to heal quickly, speak clearly, rejoin rooms without asking them to slow down. This small, fierce creature demanded the opposite. She rewarded nothing but patience. Around her, silence was not damage. It was manners. One late afternoon, when sunset turned the snow lavender, Dr. Klein placed a dish of food just inside the enclosure and stepped away. The Bobcat waited until every human had retreated. Then she emerged from the den box, shoulders rolling low, paws landing with soundless precision. She ate only after looking once toward Daniel. He was standing at the flat stone, palms open. The Bobcat lowered her head, took one careful bite, then carried the rest behind the spruce branch as if privacy were a sacred right. Daniel nodded once. 3 feet from safety had held. The first sign did not look like much to anyone who had not waited for it. It came on a morning when the sky was low and pearly, with snow resting in soft ridges along the top of the enclosure fence. The clinic yard smelled of thawing straw and wood smoke from Dr. Klein's chimney. Beyond the pines, a raven crossed the pale air with black wings steady against the cold. Daniel arrived carrying a repaired heat lamp bracket and a paper sack Elise had sent with him. The sack held banana bread wrapped in foil, because Elise believed people who spent too much time around injured animals forgot to eat. Daniel had written back that banana bread was not a medical instrument. She had replied, "Neither are you, but we keep using you." By then, the Bobcat had a name, though Daniel still used it carefully. Juniper had come from the bushes near the culvert, from the silver-green shrubs around the rehab property, and from the way she seemed to prefer thorny shelter to any comfort humans offered. Dr. Klein had written it on a chart first. Daniel had seen the word clipped to the gate and felt something settle inside him. Juniper did not care about names. She cared about distance, weather, movement, food, and whether the humans remembered to leave the spruce branch where she had dragged it. If Dr. Klein shifted it while cleaning, Juniper returned it to the same crooked angle before evening. If a dish was placed too near the open side of the pen, she hooked it ite hat one paw and pulled it behind cover. She had a particular dislike for the yellow pan, which she flipped upside down twice with offended precision. Dr. Klein blamed glare. Daniel blamed taste. That morning, he finished replacing the bracket outside the quarantine shed, then brushed snow from the flat stone near Juniper's fence. His gloves were damp. The cold made his knuckles ache. He flexed his fingers slowly before taking out his notebook. Juniper was on the climbing shelf, not hidden, not relaxed. Her injured foreleg had grown steadier, though she still placed it carefully when she climbed down. The pale crescent near her left whiskers showed against her winter coat. Her notched ear turned toward Daniel, then away, then back again. He sat on the feed bucket and began practicing signs. Not for her, exactly. He told himself that each time. The movements helped his hands loosen, helped his mind settle, helped the silence feel less like a wall. He signed weather, cold, wait, safe. Safe still felt awkward to him. His fingers made the shape, but his heart did not always believe it. Juniper watched. At first, she watched the way bobcats watched mice under snow, with complete attention and no generosity. Her pupils narrowed. Her whiskers pushed forward. The black tufts at her ears made tiny adjustments each time his hands moved. When Daniel paused, she looked at his face. When he moved again, she returned to his fingers. He tried not to make meaning too soon. People did that. They took one glance from an animal and built a bridge across it before the animal had agreed to cross. Daniel had seen visitors whisper love into every cautious stare. He had learned better. Juniper's attention belonged to Juniper. It did not have to be a gift. Still, his chest warmed. The clinic cat, Amos, appeared in the window behind him, pressed his round face to the glass, and opened his mouth in a silent complaint Daniel could not hear. The porcupine in the far pen waddled over to inspect Daniel's boot tracks, then seemed disappointed that they were not edible. Dr. Klein came out with coffee, saw him signing to the air, and set the mug on the porch rail with a note beneath it. For the unauthorized interpreter. Daniel read it and shook his head, but he drank the coffee. Warmth came that way, not all at once, but in little pieces people could carry without being embarrassed. He looked back toward Juniper and signed wait again. One hand upright, one hand moving. Juniper's head tilted. It was a small motion, barely more than a question passing through her neck. Her body remained folded on the shelf, paws tucked, tail tip curved against the boards. But the tilt was so clear, so deliberate, that Daniel's hand stopped in the air. Juniper held still. Snow slid from a pine branch outside the fence and fell in a soft white hush he saw but did not hear. A flurry of powder lifted around the trunk. Daniel felt his pulse in his wrist, where his hand remained raised. He lowered it slowly. Juniper's head straightened. Daniel waited. Then he signed wait once more, smaller this time. Again, the notched ear angled forward. Again, her head tipped, less from fear than from study. She was not obeying. She was not understanding the word as a person understood it. She was reading movement, pattern, calm. She was finding Daniel inside the shape of his hands. Daniel swallowed. He had spent years afraid that the parts of him left after the war were too broken for anyone to read. Conversations passed him by. Rooms grew impatient. Even kindness sometimes arrived too fast and left him tired. But here was this wounded wildcat noticing the language that had grown out of his loss. His eyes stung, and he looked down before anyone could see. When he looked up again, Juniper had shifted her weight. She stretched her forelegs, claws briefly appearing against the wood, then folded herself back with the elegance of a creature, pretending she had meant to do something else entirely. Her tail flicked once. She looked away toward the trees. Daniel almost laughed. "All right," he whispered, though the word was mostly breath. He opened his palm and signed thank you, a motion he had practiced with Elise until Milo began using it whenever he wanted pie. Juniper did not tilt her head this time. She stared at him, blinked once, then slowly closed Beote hot eyes halfway and opened them again. "Doctor." Klein saw it from the porch. The blink lasted less than a second. It promised nothing. It gave no permission. But in the careful world between a deaf veteran and a young bobcat, it was the first tiny bridge laid across the snow. Daniel did not cross it. He only sat there, hands still, coffee cooling beside him, while Juniper watched the woods and let him remain. By late December, Daniel S. visits had become part of the Clinic S weather. He came after breakfast when the roads allowed it, his old truck easing through the pines with a toolbox behind the seat and sawdust on the floor mats. Frost clung to the windshield in feathered patterns. The heater still worked only when it felt appreciated, so he drove with one gloved hand near the vent and the other steady on the wheel, watching the ditches for the quick brown flicker of hairs. At Dr. Klein's place, mornings began slowly. Steam rose from the water buckets. Straw crackled under boots. The clinic windows glowed amber against the snow, and the air held its mixture of cedar shavings, coffee, cold metal, and the clean sharpness of animals who belonged more to weather than to walls. Daniel would lift one hand to Dr. Klein through the window. She would answer, with two fingers raised, usually while holding a clipboard in her teeth. Amos, the clinic cat, had taken to sitting on the copier, warming his paws and looking personally betrayed whenever paper came out beneath him. The porcupine, whose name was Mr. Button, despite no one remembering who had named him, had learned that Daniel S. coat pockets sometimes smelled faintly of apples, and he inspected them with the solemnity of a customs officer. Juniper watched all of it from her enclosure. She was stronger now. The lifted paw had settled. She climbed the shelf without hesitation, landing so quietly that snow on the railing barely shifted. Her body had filled out beneath the thick winter coat, and the pale crescent on her muzzle had softened into a marker rather than a wound. She remained wary, private, and quick to vanish behind her spruce branch when strangers came near. But for Daniel, she stayed visible more often. That was enough. He never called her to him. He never reached through the fence. He never pretended the daily rhythm meant ownership. The rules mattered because they kept affection from becoming selfish. Dr. Klein said Juniper S. future would depend on whether she could stay wild enough to return to the ridge when spring came. Daniel always nodded when she said it. Then he went home and sat too long at his kitchen table. At the clinic, their language stayed simple. Daniel placed himself by the flat stone, showed empty hands, and waited. Juniper answered when she wished, by remaining where she was. Sometimes she gave the slow half-blink. Sometimes she turned her back and groomed one shoulder with deliberate focus, rasping her tongue through the fur, as if Daniel had become no more interesting than a fence post. Once, she lifted a paw and cleaned between her toes for nearly 5 minutes, while staring directly at him, a performance so pointed that Dr. Klein wrote, "She is reviewing your manners." Daniel wrote back, "Passing grade?" "Doctor." Klein looked toward Juniper, who had begun chewing the edge of a harmless bark strip with great seriousness. "Incomplete," she wrote. The small kindnesses of those days gathered like snow on a branch. Elise sent soup in jars with labels so bossy Daniel could read them from across the room. Potato. Heat this. Not optional. Milo drew a bobcat with enormous ears and mailed it to the clinic, where Dr. Klein pinned it near the supply shelf. Juniper, upon seeing the paper flap in a draft, stalked it from behind her log for half an hour. Daniel repaired the latch on Dr. Klein's back gate, and she paid him with coffee and the last piece of banana bread, though Amos sat on the table beside it as if considering legal action. At home, Daniel carried the quiet back with him. The cabin no longer felt quite the same after Juniper entered his days. It still had the dipping porch step, the stubborn stove, the hearing aids beside the salt shaker. But now he found himself sweeping snow from the porch before dawn because he imagined how a careful paw might test a surface. He stacked firewood with the knots facing outward, thinking of claws and bark, and how wild creatures needed texture beneath them. He practiced signs at the kitchen window, not because Juniper knew words, but because her watching had made his hands feel useful again. That was the private change he did not explain to Elise. Before Juniper, Daniel had thought healing meant becoming more like the man he had been before. Louder, easier, less trouble to others. Around the Bobcat, he began to wonder whether healing could mean becoming truer to the man who remained. A quieter man, a patient man, a man who could sit outside a fence in the cold and not mistake distance for rejection. One evening, Elise arrived at the clinic while Daniel was replacing weather stripping around the feed room door. She wore a red scarf and carried a covered dish, her cheeks pink from the wind. "You re-thinner," she said, facing him carefully. He pretended to misunderstand and patted the doorframe. "The building?" She rolled her eyes and handed him the dish. "The building looks better fed than you." Juniper, from the far shelf, flicked her notched ear toward Elise's movement. She did not run. That alone made Daniel's sister go still. "She knows you," Elise said softly. Daniel looked through the mesh. Juniper was crouched in a patch of lavender dusk, front paws tucked under her chest, tail tip moving once against the board. Snowflakes had gathered on her whiskers, making her look stern and faintly decorated. When Daniel lifted his hand in the sign for wait, she tilted her head just enough for Elise to see. Elise pressed her lips together. Daniel knew that look. She was trying not to make the moment bigger than it was, trying not to scare it away. So he wrote in his notebook, "She thinks my signing is bad." Elise laughed silently, one hand over her mouth. Juniper blinked at both of them, unimpressed by human emotion, then turned and disappeared behind her spruce branch with the smooth dignity of a queen leaving court. Daniel stood there a while after Elise went inside to warm the dish. The clinic lights hummed faintly through the frozen air, a vibration he could feel in the gate under his palm. Snow fell without hurry. Beyond the enclosure, the forest waited. For the first time in years, Daniel did not feel the quiet pushing him away from the world. It had made room for him. By January, the cold settled so deeply into Tamarack Ridge that even the fence wire wore frost all day. The sun rose pale behind the pines and slid across the clinic yard without much warmth, touching the snowbanks, the den boxes, the water buckets, and the trail Daniel had worn between the supply shed and Juniper's enclosure. His boot prints came and went in the same careful line. Right foot dragging slightly, left step firm. Some mornings fresh snow erased him before noon. Some mornings Juniper studied the marks, as if they were a message written only for her. She had grown sleek with recovery. Her coat had thickened into tawny gray and russet, with darker spots gathered along her legs and shoulders like shadows under leaves. The notched ear gave her face a permanent look of alert disagreement. The pale crescent near her whiskers had become so familiar that Daniel's eye found it before he noticed anything else. She still preferred the corner behind the spruce branch, still dragged her food where she could eat unseen, still disliked the yellow pan with a conviction no one could explain. But joy had begun to appear in careful, wild shapes. One morning, Daniel arrived to find the yellow pan flipped upside down on the climbing shelf. Juniper sat beside it, vacant the hat, both front paws tucked neatly, looking away toward the trees as if the pan had climbed there by itself and embarrassed everyone. Dr. Klein discovered the scene, stood beside Daniel, and wrote in his notebook, "Evidence suggests pan migration." Daniel wrote, "Rare winter behavior." Juniper blinked once, as though disappointed in both of them. Another day, the snow in her enclosure had crusted hard overnight, and she found the only soft drift beneath the low cedar bough. Instead of walking through it, she sprang straight up, landed in the powder with all four paws, vanished to her shoulders, then emerged with such offended dignity that Daniel had to turn away before his smile became too visible. Juniper shook one paw, then another, then sat down and glared at the snow for failing to meet professional standards. She was not playful the way a tame animal was playful. Her little bursts of movement were private tests of muscle, weather, and mood. She stalked fallen pine cones as if they had insulted her. She pounced at mauve shadows when the sun moved across the boards. She chased nothing Daniel could see, then stopped suddenly and washed her chest with complete seriousness. Every act carried wild purpose, even when the humans could not find it. Daniel loved that most of all. He loved that she never performed affection to make people comfortable. She did not soften because anyone wanted her soft. She chose each inch of ease, and the choosing made it precious. The quiet joy of those weeks changed the clinic. Dr. Klein started leaving Daniel small notes by the coffee maker, not because she needed to, but because written words let him be included without the strain of catching every sentence. May Collins stopped by twice with reports from the ridge, and always pretended she came only for paperwork, though she stood longer than necessary near Juniper's fence. Elise visited on Saturdays when the roads were clear, bringing soup, bread, and family news Daniel pretended not to crave. Her boys came once, bundled so heavily they looked like two walking laundry piles. Milo, 8 years old and unable to whisper when excited, had been warned 12 times to stay behind the second fence. His older brother, Noah, took the job seriously and held Milo's sleeve as if escorting a dangerous balloon. Daniel crouched in front of them and signed slowly, quiet, distance, respect. Milo signed back, "Bobcat Queen." Daniel nodded. Accurate. Juniper appeared only briefly that day. She slipped from behind her spruce branch, crossed the back of the enclosure, and climbed to her shelf. The boys froze. Even Milo's mouth stopped moving. Snowflakes landed on Juniper's ear tufts, and her amber eyes passed over them with cool consideration. Noah lifted one mittened hand and gave a tiny wave. Juniper turned her head away. Milo whispered. She waved inside. Elise looked at Daniel, and her face softened, with the kind of laughter that stayed behind the eyes. Later, inside the clinic, Milo drew Juniper wearing a crown made of pine needles. Amos sat on the table and tried to lie on the drawing before it was finished. Noah fed quarters into the old vending machine for hot chocolate, and when it refused to work, Daniel fixed it with one firm tap that made the boys look at him as if he had commanded lightning. Dr. Klein labeled the drawing official portrait and taped it near the first one. Daniel carried that small noise of family home with him, even though he had not heard most of it. At the cabin, winter evenings became less bare. Elise's soup warmed on the stove while he sanded a new handle for Dr. Klein's feed scoop. The blue blanket, the one he had left near the culvert, had been washed and returned to him after Juniper no longer needed it. He kept it folded over the back of the kitchen chair. Sometimes he rested his hand on it when the wind moved hard through the pines. He did not pretend Juniper was his. He did not pretend the ache would be smaller when she returned to the wild. But he had stopped measuring love only by keeping. That realization came to him one afternoon at the clinic, when the snow clouds opened briefly and sunlight poured through the pines in pale gold bands. Juniper had climbed Deovekepno from her shelf and was walking along the inside fence line, placing each paw with soundless care. Daniel stood at the flat stone. He signed wait, more from habit than request. Juniper paused. Then she stepped toward the fence until only a few feet remained between them. Not close enough to touch. Never that. Close enough for Daniel to see the tiny crystals of snow melting on her whiskers. Close enough for her breath to fog once against the cold air. She lowered her head, rubbed her cheek lightly against the cedar post inside the enclosure, and left her scent there, strong and invisible. Daniel understood. This was her place, marked by her own claim. Still, she had chosen to mark it while looking at him. His chest filled with a warmth so quiet it almost felt like peace. He opened his palm, empty and still. Juniper looked at his hand, then at his face, and gave the slowest blink he had seen yet. Nothing grand happened. No one cried. No one spoke. The afternoon simply held them there, divided by a fence, joined by patience, while the sunlight thinned across the snow. By the end of January, the weather changed before the calendar did. The mornings still arrived white and hard, with ice feathering the clinic windows, but beneath the cold, something shifted. The wind came from a different direction. It moved down from the higher ridges carrying resin, far snow, and hidden thaw. Clouds gathered over Cabinet Mountain in long, bruised bands, and the pines rocked at their tops even when the yard below seemed still. Juniper noticed first. Daniel saw it in the way her body began to follow things beyond the enclosure. She no longer spent whole afternoons folded on the shelf, watching the clinic with half-lidded patience. She paced the back fence, not frantically, but with intent. One pass, pause, head lifted, another pass. Her paws landed in the same narrow trail until the snow packed down beneath her weight. At the corner nearest the ravine, she stood with her notched ear turned toward the woods and her whiskers forward, reading messages no human could see. Dr. Klein watched too. She says hearing spring before we are, she wrote in Daniel S. notebook, though spring was still a long way from kindness. Daniel stared at the words longer than necessary. He had known release would come if Juniper healed well. He had told himself that truth so often it had worn smooth. A bobcat did not belong to a clinic yard. She belonged to shadow, stone, creek beds, rabbit trails, and the blue hours when human eyes gave up too soon. Love, if it was honest, had to make room for that. Still, knowing a thing did not keep it from hurting. That week, Juniper refused the yellow pan so completely that Dr. Klein removed it from service and wrote retirement ceremony pending on a strip of tape. Daniel placed the pan upside down on the supply shelf, like a defeated helmet. Amos climbed inside it within 10 minutes, stared through the rim, and looked so pleased that even Dr. Klein laughed when Daniel pointed. Mr. Button inspected the empty shelf afterward and seemed disappointed that the ceremony had not included apples. Small things kept the clinic gentle, while the larger truth moved closer. Juniper's appetite changed. Some mornings she ate with clean efficiency, dragging food behind her spruce branch. Other mornings she sniffed once and walked away, too occupied with the wind to bother. She began scratching the cedar posts more often, leaving pale marks where her claws stripped the surface. At dusk, when the light went violet and the first stars appeared above the ridge, she climbed to the highest platform and sat facing west. Daniel stood at the flat stone and watched her watch the world. The sight made him feel both proud and hollow. He remembered the first night at the culvert, the lifted paw, the burrs under her chin, the fierce warning in her eyes. That animal had been cornered by weakness. This one was returning to herself. Her shoulders had filled, her balance had sharpened, the limp had faded into memory. When a raven landed on the fence one afternoon, Juniper sprang upward with such sudden power that the bird flung itself into the air, offended and alive, while she landed below and looked almost satisfied. She was readying. Daniel's hands had fewer words for that than his heart needed. Elise noticed his quiet when she came Saturday, with Stu wrapped in towels. She found him repairing the old gate latch near the ravine trail, though it did not need repair so much as his hands needed occupation. Snow dusted his shoulders. His pencil sat behind his ear, forgotten. "You redoing the thing," she said. He looked up. She pointed at the latch. "Fixing what is broken." Daniel wiped his hands on his coat and gave her a look that meant he had no idea what she was talking about. Elise accepted the lie kindly. She leaned beside him against the fence, keeping the respectful distance they had all learned. Juniper paced the back line, tail tip flicking, then stopped to sniff the air through the mesh. The bobcat's cheek fur ruffled in the wind. For a moment she looked not like a patient, but like a piece of the forest temporarily held in shape. "She won to forget you just because she leaves," Elise said. Daniel read her lips and looked away. He did not trust his face. Juniper pressed one shoulder against the cedar post and rubbed hard, scent marking with slow, deliberate force. Then she turned and scraped the snow with her hind paws, scattering powder behind her in two sharp kicks. A little burst of snow flew through the fence and landed on Daniel's boot. Elise smiled. "She's making sure you know who owns this place." Daniel took out his notebook and wrote, "Moat was uncertain until now." Elise laughed, and the sound showed in her shoulders. A gust moved through the pines, bending them all in the same direction. Juniper froze. Her head lifted. Every line of her body sharpened toward the ridge. Daniel followed her gaze, but saw only trees, gray sky, and the long white slope dropping toward the creek. For Juniper, there was more. Perhaps the hidden trail of a snowshoe hare. Perhaps the musk of another bobcat passing beyond the ravine. Perhaps only the old pull of territory and weather, stronger than food, stronger than routine, older than fear. Daniel signed wait before he meant to. Juniper did not turn. The sign hung uselessly in the cold between them. He lowered his hand, ashamed of the small selfishness that had risen through him. Wait had been their bridge, but bridges were not meant to become chains. That night, he took the blue blanket from the back of his kitchen chair and folded it again, tighter than before. He set it on the table beside his chipped mug and sat until the stove burned low. Outside, wind pressed snow against the window in long, soft breaths. He imagined Juniper on her platform, facing the dark ridge, listening to a world that had always been hers. He wanted her safe. He wanted her free. He did not know how to ask for Bobcat hot without losing something. In the morning, when he returned to the clinic, Juniper was waiting on the highest shelf. Not for him, perhaps. For weather. For distance. For whatever moved beneath the snow clouds. But when Daniel reached the flat stone, she looked down at him, held his gaze, and gave one slow blink before turning back toward the trees. The storm arrived faster than the forecast had promised. By mid-afternoon, the clinic yard had turned the color of ash. Snow moved in long white ropes across the open ground, twisting between the pens and piling against the doors. The pines beyond the ravine bent until their dark tops blurred into the sky. Even from inside the feed room, Daniel could feel the weather pressing against the walls, a steady shudder through boards, hinges, and old glass. Doctor. Klein had closed the front clinic early. May had called to say the county road was growing mean near the bridge. Elise had sent 3 messages in a row, which meant she was trying not to sound afraid. Road's bad. Stay there if needed. Mote mean it. Daniel. He wrote back, yes, ma am. Then, after a moment, he added, Amos is in charge. Elise replied with a row of laughing faces and one angry cat face, and Daniel stood with the phone in his hand, longer than necessary, grateful for the silly warmth of it, while wind shoved snow against the door. The animals knew the storm before the people finished naming it. Mr. Button had retreated into his straw and refused to show even his nose. The fox in the recovery pen had buried every bit of food under shavings as if preparing for the end of civilization. Amos sat on the front counter with his paws tucked beneath him, wearing the grave expression of a judge disappointed in weather management. Juniper was restless. Daniel saw her from the supply room window, a low moving shape through the blowing snow. She crossed the back of her enclosure again and again, stopping at the ravine corner where the wind funneled through the trees. Her winter coat lifted along her shoulders. Her notched ear flattened, then rose. Snow gathered briefly on her back and vanished when she shook herself once, hard and irritated. Doctor. Klein stood beside Daniel, arms folded tight. She does tea like that wind, she said slowly, then wrote in his notebook to be sure. Too much movement. Too many scents. Storms make them edgy. Daniel nodded, but his eyes had already gone to the gate. He had fixed that latch more than once. Not because it failed, he told himself, but because the gate sat in the worst corner, where snowmelt froze, thawed, and froze again inside the hinge. Earlier that week, he had noticed the catch sticking when the temperature dropped. He had filed it smooth, oiled it, tested it twice. Now, through the white blur, he saw the outer chain tremble. The wind pulled at the gate in short, angry jerks. The latch held, then held again. Juniper paced past it, shoulder brushing the cedar post, tail tip snapping once behind her. Daniel reached for his coat. Doctor. Klein touched his sleeve. Not alone. He did not argue. He only pointed to the gate, then to his toolbox. They moved quickly but carefully, the way people moved around fear when animals were near. Doctor. Klein gathered a second safety clip and a length of rope. Daniel pulled on gloves, shoved a flashlight into his pocket, and stepped outside. The cold hit like a hand against his face. Snow erased distance. The clinic, only yards behind him, became a yellow haze. He could not hear the wind, but he felt it batter his chest and steal warmth from the seams of his coat. Ice grains stung his cheeks. Beneath his boots, packed snow squealed and shifted. Juniper saw him immediately. She froze near the back fence, one forepaw lifted. Even in the storm, her eyes found him. Amber, sharp, alive with the old wild alarm. Daniel stopped at the flat stone, though it had almost disappeared beneath drifting snow. He lifted his empty palm. Wait. The sign looked fragile in weather that cared nothing for hands. Juniper stared at him. For one strange second, The storm seemed to pause around the small space between them. Daniel saw the pale crescent near her whiskers. Snow clung to her ear tufts. Her breath came in quick white bursts. Then the gate jerked hard. The latch snapped upward. Daniel saw it happen in pieces. The catch lifted. The chain slipped against the post. The wind slammed the gate inward, just wide enough to break the careful world they had built. Doctor. Klein lunged for the rope. Juniper moved faster than thought. She did not bolt wildly at first. She dropped low, every muscle deciding at once, and shot toward the opening with the silent force of a shadow finding its old shape. Daniel stepped sideways, not to block her, because blocking a frightened bobcat would only turn fear into danger, but to widen his body near the gap and slow her choice. His boot struck buried ice. He went down on one knee, pain flashing up his hip. His glove hit the snow. The flashlight skidded away, its beam spinning once across the fence. The gate, Juniper S. face. She stopped 2 yards from him. For the briefest breath, they looked at each other. Daniel did not reach. That restraint would haunt him and comfort him for years. He lifted his hand again, shaking now. Wait. Juniper's ears angled forward. Her eyes changed. Not soft. Not tame. But aware. The storm blew snow between them. Behind her, the open gate banged against the post. Beyond Daniel, the ravine trees swayed, full of dark spaces and ancient invitations. Then a branch cracked somewhere in the woods. Juniper spun toward the movement and was gone. Not disappeared like a magic trick. Gone like a wild creature was gone, body flattening through the opening, paws striking snow, tail black-tipped and brief, shoulders vanishing between juniper bushes beyond the fence. Daniel pushed himself up too fast and nearly fell again. Doctor. Klein caught his arm. Her mouth moved, saying something he could not catch through snow and urgency. He shook his head, pointed toward the ravine, and tried to step forward. She held tighter. Safe search. She signed clumsily with one hand, using the few signs she knew. Not chase. The words struck harder than cold. Not chase. Daniel knew she was right. A chase would drive Juniper deeper, farther, more frightened. A human crashing through brush in a storm could turn one bad mistake into a worse one. But knowing did not stop the sight of those tracks from cutting through him. They led away from the broken gate in a narrow line, clean at first, then quickly filling with snow. Daniel stood in the storm with one glove wet, one knee aching, and the gate swinging behind him. He watched until the tracks blurred into white. At his feet, half buried beside the post, lay a small tuft of tawny fur caught on rough cedar. He picked it up gently, as if it weighed more than it did. For the first 2 days after Juniper vanished, the storm made searching feel like trying to read a letter while someone kept erasing the ink. Daniel stayed at Dr. Klein S. clinic that first night because the roads closed before dark. He slept, if it could be called sleep, in the back office beneath medical records, with his coat folded under his head and the smell of disinfectant, wet wool, and cold coffee around him. Every time wind shook the window, he opened his eyes. The blue blanket lay on the chair beside him. Dr. Klein had brought it from his truck without comment. It was the same blanket from the culvert, the same one Elise had mended after Milo spilled cocoa. the same old square of warmth that had somehow become part of Juniper's story. Daniel kept one hand on its edge through the night because his fear needed somewhere to rest. By morning, the world outside had gone white and shapeless. May arrived in a county truck with a thermos. She looked at Daniel's face, then wrote before speaking, "We search smart. Tracks, cameras, food stations. No chasing." Daniel nodded. It did not become easier with repetition. They began at the broken gate. The storm had filled most of Juniper's prints, but a few remained beneath low branches near the ravine. May crouched and pointed to the round impressions, the absence of claw marks, the careful spacing. Bobcat. Moving fast, then slowing. Not stumbling. Daniel clung to that last part. Not stumbling meant strength. Not stumbling meant the storm had not swallowed her immediately. Not stumbling meant she had chosen direction with her own fierce mind. They followed what they could until the tracks dissolved among wind-polished drifts. Daniel moved slowly because of his hip, jaw tight. One gloved hand, brushing pine trunks for balance. Snow fell from branches onto his shoulders in soft collapses he saw, but did not hear. Once, a snowshoe hare burst from cover and shot across the trail, leaving small wild punctuation in the powder. Daniel stopped, heart kicking, but it was only a hare. May touched his sleeve and pointed out Juniper's older line, angling toward a ridge of stone. "Predator country," she mouthed. Daniel looked up at Montfay, the dark trees, and tried to feel comfort in the phrase. Over the next week, the search widened. Dr. Klein set trail cameras along the creek and near the old logging cut. May placed scent markers and small food stations where a recovering bobcat might pass without being drawn toward houses. Daniel repaired one camera mount with numb fingers while May pretended not to notice that he had tightened it 3 times too many. Dr. Klein labeled every map point in thick black marker so Daniel could read it easily. Elise came on the 3rd day. She brought soup in a wide-mouthed jar, 2 pairs of dry socks, and a look that tried to be brave. When Daniel opened the truck door, she held up the socks first, as if practical offerings could keep emotion from spilling. "Milo said these are lucky," she said, facing him carefully. One sock had tiny cartoon trout on it. The other had pine trees. They did not match. Daniel looked at them, then at her. Elise lifted her chin. He insisted wildlife appreciates variety. For 1 second, grief loosened enough to let laughter almost through. Daniel put the mismatched socks in his coat pocket like a sacred tool. Those little bits of warmth ka pete appearing because his family did not kana ove kep what else to give him. Noah drew a map of the ridge with a giant crown, where Juniper probably had her secret castle. Walt from the lower ranch left notes under Daniel's wiper that said, "No bobcat yet. Sawan Rudravin." Amos slept on the folded blue blanket whenever Daniel forgot to guard it, and Daniel found himself too tired to move him. But each evening ended the same way. No confirmed tracks. No camera image. No tawny shape slipping between trees. Daniel began taking the long way home, stopping at every pullout, every culvert, every place where brush bent close to the road. He carried his flashlight, though he knew light would likely show only snow and bark. He wrote short notes to himself in the notebook, because the days were blurring. North Creek clear. Hair sign. Wind bad. Check ravine again. On the 10th night, he sat at his kitchen table with the blue blanket folded in front of him and the hearing aids beside the salt shaker. The cabin was warm, but he kept his coat on. The wood stove gave off a dull, red glow. Outside the window, the pines moved in moonlight, their shadows crossing the snow like slow dark water. He thought of the gate. That was the loop his mind walked until it wore a ditch. If he had replaced the latch entirely, if he had reached the gate faster, if he had not slipped, if he had not made the sign for wait, as though his wanting could hold back a life built for leaving. He knew better than to make himself the center of Juniper's wildness. She had not vanished to punish him. She had not owed him staying. But guilt did not need logic to keep breathing. It only needed an empty place to sit. The cabin had one now. Her absence changed the air more than her presence ever had. Daniel noticed the quiet where her routines had lived. No clinic visit after breakfast, no yellow pan joke, no amber eyes studying his hands, no careful blink at the flat stone. He still woke before dawn, still made coffee in the chipped brown mug, still swept the porch. Then he stood there with the broom in his hand, not knowing what came next. After 2 weeks, May found one possible track near the frozen creek, half melted and uncertain. Dr. Klein could not confirm it. Daniel stared at the blurred mark until his eyes ached, wanting it to be proof and fearing the cruelty of hope. He did not cry then. He folded the blue blanket tighter that night and placed it over the back of the kitchen chair, exactly where it had been before Juniper disappeared. Then he sat beside it until the stove settled into ash and the moon slipped behind the ridge. The world outside remained full of wild lives moving beyond him. For the first time since meeting Juniper, Daniel could not tell whether that thought comforted him or broke him. 4 years did not pass cleanly. They gathered in uneven layers, like snow against a fence line, deeper in some places than others. The first spring after Juniper disappeared came with meltwater running brown beneath the culverts and pussy willows silvering along the creek. Daniel searched less, because there were fewer tracks to follow, but his eyes still went to every shadow that moved close to the road. By summer, Dr. Klein's trail cameras had caught foxes, deer, coyotes, 1 black bear, 3 raccoons traveling like thieves, and a bobcat that might have been Juniper if longing had been allowed to decide. The angle was wrong. The ear was hidden. The muzzle blurred in rain. Daniel printed the image anyway and folded it into his notebook. He told himself it was only a record. Elise did not argue. She had learned that some grief needed a shelf, not a solution. Life continued in the quiet, stubborn way it did, around people who were still hurting. The clinic repaired the broken gate and added a second safety latch. Dr. Klein kept the yellow pan on a high shelf with a strip of tape that read retired due to artistic differences. Amos grew rounder, older, and more convinced that every clean towel existed for him. Mr. Button was released in a patch of cottonwoods, and according to May, immediately waddled under a log with the confidence of a gentleman returning to his estate. Those small facts helped Daniel breathe. At Tamarack Ridge, he finally fixed the dipping porch step. Elise arrived the next Thursday, stepped on it, and looked almost offended. "You repaired it," she said. Daniel nodded. Mort was emotionally attached to that hazard. He wrote in his notebook, "Condolences." She laughed, then looked toward the kitchen chair, where the blue blanket still hung over the back. Neither of them mentioned it. Daniel wore his hearing aids more often after that first year, though he still removed them at home when the world grew too sharp. He kept attending sign language meetings at the veterans' clinic. At first, he sat near the back and left quickly. Later, he stayed for coffee. He discovered that other men and women carried silences too, different from his but familiar in shape. Some had lost hearing to machinery, illness, age, gunfire, or war. Some signed fluently. Some wrote on phones. Some only listened with their eyes. Daniel became useful there. He fixed a wheelchair brake for an older Marine named Paul. He showed a young woman named Tessa how to replace the cracked mirror on her truck. He brought oranges once because Elise had sent too many, and the group began calling them Mercer emergency rations. The joke embarrassed him, so naturally everyone kept it alive. Still, each winter, when storms came from the west and wind moved through the pines, Daniel returned to that gate in his mind. The 4th November arrived Vikepitahat early snow. Dr. Klein had expanded the rehabilitation property by then. A new lodge stood near the old clinic, built for small retreats and community programs. One of those programs was a weekend gathering for deaf and hard of hearing veterans, arranged with the State Wildlife Foundation. Daniel almost declined when the invitation came. The flyer sat on his table for 6 days. Elise found it under his mug and read it without asking permission, because sisters sometimes treated privacy as a flexible concept. "You should go," she said. Daniel shook his head. She tapped the page where Dr. Klein's name appeared. "You already know the place." That was the problem. He wrote, "Too many ghosts." Elise read the words and sat down across from him. Outside, the first flakes had begun to fall, catching in the porch light. She did not answer quickly. That was how he knew she was choosing care instead of argument. "Maybe one of them is the ghost," she said at last. He looked away. The morning of the retreat, Daniel drove through a soft curtain of snow. Vikepite had his toolbox behind the seat, though no one had asked him to bring tools. Habit still traveled better than hope. He wore his dark wool coat, the one Elise said made him look like a retired sheriff, and tucked his notebook into the inside pocket. The blue blanket stayed at home, but a torn square of it rode with him, folded small. At the lodge, he found ramps cleared, coffee waiting, name tags written in thick marker, and people speaking with hands as much as mouths. A young veteran showed him a joke in sign that Daniel only half understood, but laughed at because the man's eyebrows did most of the work. Dr. Klein greeted him with a hug he accepted stiffly, then less stiffly. May Collins, grayer now, handed him a cup and pointed to the new latch on the outer fence as if presenting a masterpiece. Daniel examined it and gave a solemn thumbs up. For a while, the day was almost ordinary. There was a workshop on service animals that carefully explained why wildlife was different. There was a shared lunch where Amos, ancient and shameless, attempted to steal turkey from a guest's plate. There was a moment when Daniel repaired a loose hinge on a storage cabinet, and 3 veterans gathered around as if watching surgery. In the afternoon, snow thickened. The group moved outside for a short walk along the safe viewing fence, where unreleasable birds sheltered in covered mews and recovering animals remained far from public eyes. Daniel stayed near the back. The cold smelled of pine bark, wool hats, and distant chimney smoke. His boots made deep marks in the path. He could feel laughter around him as vibration, see it in shoulders and faces. But his attention drifted toward the ravine. The juniper bushes were still there, older, wider, holding snow. Daniel stopped. At first, he thought his memory had placed her there, because the land had asked too much of him. A low shape stood between the silver-green branches, and the fallen cottonwood, still as a carved thing. Tawny gray coat, broad cheeks, black-tipped tail held low. Then the head turned. One ear carried a small notch near the tip. Daniel's hand tightened around the fence rail. People behind him began to notice his stillness before they noticed the bobcat. Conversations faded one face at a time. Doctor. Klein stepped forward, then stopped. May lifted her palm to keep everyone back. The bobcat did not look at the crowd. She looked at Daniel. Older now, stronger, scarred faintly near the left whisker line, pale crescent still visible beneath winter fur. Her eyes were the same amber he had carried through 4 winters. Juniper stood in the falling snow, reading him across the years. Daniel did not move. He only opened his empty hand, fingers trembling, and let the old sign rise between them. Wait. Juniper did not obey the sign. She considered it. That was the only honest way Daniel could have understood. Ve kep hata te happened next. She stood between the juniper bushes with snow gathering along her back, her lifted pay, a ve kep suspended above the white ground, and she studied the old movement of his hand as if it had been stored somewhere in her body rather than her mind. Wait. The veterans along the path became still. Some had stopped mid-sign, hands hovering in the cold air. One woman pressed her fingers lightly to her throat. Doctor. Klein stood beside the gate with her lips parted, not speaking, because words would have been too large for such a narrow and fragile moment. Daniel felt the fence rail under his palm. The wood was cold enough to burn. Snow touched his eyelashes and melted there. He could smell wool, pine resin, coffee from the lodge, and beneath it all the clean wild musk that came when an animal carried the forest on her coat. Juniper lowered her paw. She did not come in a straight line. Bobcats did not offer themselves that way. She angled left, paused near the fallen cottonwood, then crossed behind a low patch of brush where only her shoulders showed. Her short tail flicked twice. She placed each paw with the silent caution that had always made Daniel think of shadows. May signed to the group with firm hands. Stay back. Quiet. A young veteran named Tessa, who had been joking about Amos stealing turkey 20 minutes earlier, tucked her phone away without taking a picture. Daniel noticed that and loved her for it. Paul, the older Marine, removed his cap as if a prayer had entered the snow. Elise stood near the porch steps, with both hands pressed over her mouth, her eyes fixed on her brother. Juniper slipped closer. There was a second fence between her and the public path, a safe barrier of wire and cedar, but the old rehabilitation gate opened into a small service pocket where Dr. Klein sometimes placed scent stations. Juniper approached that outer corner, not trapped, not lured, simply choosing the nearest place where Daniel's hand rested on the rail. Daniel did not step forward. His whole body wanted to. 4 years of winter mornings and blurred tracks moved inside him like a tide. His hand trembled against the rail. The small, torn square of blanket in his coat pocket seemed suddenly heavy, as if every night he had spent missing her had taken a shape. But he stayed. He had learned this much from loving a wild thing. The feeling in his chest was his to carry. The choice was hers. Juniper stopped 1 pace from the fence. Her amber eyes moved over his face. Daniel wondered what she saw. More gray in his beard. A deeper line near one eye. Shoulders held carefully because old injuries disliked cold. A man who had not become what he used to be, but had somehow remained. He lifted his right hand slowly, palm open. Juniper's whiskers pushed forward. Her nose worked once, then again. She drew in his scent through snow and years. Her notched ear twitched toward the lodge, where someone shifted and caught themselves. She did not look away from Daniel. He signed, "Thank you." The sign broke him more than weight had, because there had been so many things he had never been able to thank her for sitting behind a spruce branch while he learned that silence could be gentle, for watching his hands when he believed the world had stopped reading him, for leaving when her wild heart required it, even though it hurt him, for returning without any promise that she would stay. Juniper blinked. Then she lowered her head. At first, Daniel thought she meant to scent mark the cedar post beside the fence, the way she had done years ago. She rubbed her cheek along the wood once, leaving an invisible message meant for bobcats and wind. It was so like her that a small, impossible laugh shook in his chest. Then she shifted. With a quiet, deliberate motion, Juniper pressed the side of her head through the open square of the fence, just enough to touch the back of Daniel's still hand. Not hard, not tame, not a pet's eager nuzzle. A single head bump, silent and sure. Daniel's knees nearly failed him. He felt the thick winter fur against his skin, colder at the tips, warm beneath. He felt the shape of her skull, the brief weight of trust, the faint vibration of her breath. He did not close his fingers. He did not stroke her. His hand remained open, because the gift was already more than he had known how to ask for. Behind him, Elise made a small broken sound he could not hear, but saw in the way her shoulders folded. Dr. Klein covered her eyes with one hand, then lowered it quickly, as though afraid to miss even a second. Paul turned his face away. Tessa wiped her cheek with the heel of her glove. Around them, people who understood silence better than most stood crying quietly in the snow, not because the moment was loud, but because it was not. Daniel's tears came slowly. They gathered before falling, warm against skin gone numb from cold. He had not wept at the gate. He had not wept over the blurred track by the creek. He had not wept on those nights, with the blue blanket folded over the chair. Now one tear slipped down, then another. Juniper held there for 2 breaths. Then she withdrew. She sat back in the snow, composed and watchful, as if she had not just opened a door in every person present. Snow powdered her whiskers. The pale crescent by her muzzle shone faintly when she turned her head. She licked one shoulder once, with perfect practical focus, restoring order to a universe that humans had clearly made emotional. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the group, mixed with tears. Even Elise smiled while crying. Amos, watching from the lodge window, yawned with magnificent indifference and placed one paw on the glass. Milo would have called it rude. Daniel would later agree. But in that moment, Daniel only stood with his open hand still raised. Juniper looked at him, slow blinked once, and turned toward the ravine. She had come close enough to tell him something no spoken language could have carried. She remembered. And more than that, she had chosen. Juniper did not stay after the head bump. That mattered more than anyone wanted to say. She turned toward the ravine with the same quiet certainty she had carried as a young bobcat on the climbing shelf. Only now her movements held the strength of seasons lived beyond human fences. She paused once beside the fallen cottonwood, looked back through the drifting snow, and then slipped between the juniper bushes, until the brush closed behind her. The people remained still for several breaths after she vanished. No one clapped, no one rushed the fence. Even the younger veterans seemed to understand that the proper answer to such a gift was not noise, but respect. Daniel stood with his hands still open, feeling the place where her fur had touched his skin. The cold had returned quickly, but beneath it there remained a small warmth, as precise as a coal held in ash. Elise came to him first. She did not hug him right away. She knew better than to startle him when his body was still somewhere between memory and present. Instead, she stepped into his line of sight and touched 2 fingers to her heart, then pointed gently toward the ravine. Daniel nodded. His face had gone pale. His eyes were wet. But something in him had loosened, something that had been tied too tightly for 4 winters. Doctor. Klein wiped her cheeks. They kept Itehat both gloved hands and immediately pretended she had only been brushing away snow. May saw this and wrote on Daniel S. notebook, "Veterinarian reports weather in eyes." Daniel looked at the sentence, then at Dr. Klein. For the first time that day, he smiled. A soft laugh passed through the group, small and relieved. Amos, still in the lodge window, pawed once at the glass as if offended that no one had invited him to supervise the emotional recovery. Tessa signed that the cat wanted credit. Paul signed back that cats always wanted credit. Daniel missed part of it, but caught enough from their faces to understand. The retreat changed after that. Not loudly. It did not become a miracle people tried to own. Dr. Klein made sure of that. She reminded everyone that Juniper was wild, that no one should approach her, feed her, follow her, or search for her beyond approved observation points. The staff checked the fences again. May walked the ravine trail and found Juniper's tracks angling away toward higher cover, steady and healthy. Daniel went inside with the others, but he did not sit near the fire. He stood by the window, holding his mug without drinking, looking toward the brush where she had disappeared. He did not feel empty. That surprised him. For years, he had believed seeing Juniper again would either heal the ache or sharpen it beyond bearing. Instead, the ache had changed shape. It no longer felt like a locked room. It felt like a trail leading somewhere he did not need to follow. Late that afternoon, after the sky began to darken and the retreat group gathered for supper, Milo and Noah arrived with Elise's husband. They had driven carefully through the snow because Elise had sent one message that said only, "You need to come see your uncle." Milo burst through the lodge door with a scarf half unwrapped and eyes full of questions. "Did she really remember?" he asked. Too loud. Then immediately clapped both hands over his mouth, because he remembered the rules too late. Daniel crouched in front of him and signed slowly, "Yes," quietly. Milo nodded with grave seriousness, then whispered, "Quiet remembering is better." Noah, taller now and trying hard to seem less amazed than he was, stood beside the window and looked out at the ravine. "Is she gone again?" Daniel joined him. Outside, snow had softened the footprints along the fence. The juniper bushes stood dark and silver under the evening light. For a moment, nothing moved. Then May lifted one hand from near the outer trail. Everyone froze again, but this time the stillness carried wonder before fear. Daniel turned. At the far side of the meadow, where the ravine bent toward a cluster of young pines, Juniper had reappeared. She was not alone. 2 half-grown kits stood behind her in the brush, nearly hidden by shadow and snow. They were lankier than she was, with oversized paws, tufted ears, and the uncertain dignity of young wild things still learning how to be invisible. One had a darker stripe along its cheek. The other had a pale splash of fur beneath its chin, and kept lifting one front paw, not injured, just undecided about the cold. No one moved. Daniel felt his breath catch. Juniper stood ahead of them, body angled between her young and the humans. Her posture was not fear. It was warning and trust braided together. She had not brought them close enough to be touched, not close enough to be claimed. She had brought them only close enough to be seen. That was another kind of answer. The darker kit peered around her shoulder and stared at the lodge with round amber eyes. The pale-chinned one sniffed toward the fence, then sneezed once at a flake of snow landing on its nose. Milo pressed Beote hat hands over his mouth so hard his cheeks puffed out. Noah's eyes widened, and even Paul, who had survived storms of his own, looked as if the world had become gentler than expected. Juniper gave the kits a low glance. The darker one immediately sat down, as if remembering a lesson. The pale-chinned one sat a second later, but placed one paw on top of the other's tail. The darker kit turned Ve Kep Ite Hot, offended slowness, and removed the tail without drama. Elise made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. Daniel did not hear it, but he saw it. He saw it in her shoulders, in Milo shaking silently, in Dr. Klein's hand pressed against her mouth again. Warmth moved through them carefully, like candlelight passing from window to window. Juniper looked at Daniel. Not long. Not softly. She was a mother now, and the world had become larger than old memory. Her attention belonged first to the two young lives behind her. But she looked at him long enough. Daniel lifted his hand, not signing wait this time. He signed safe. His fingers formed the word better than they used to. Juniper's notched ear turned forward. She held his gaze, then lowered her head and brushed her cheek once against the trunk of a small pine. The kits watched her, learning. The darker one copied the motion clumsily on a branch too thin for dignity. Snow spilled onto its own head, and it shook itself in silent outrage. Milo nearly folded in half, trying not to laugh. Then Juniper stepped back. The kits followed, awkward and beautiful, vanishing one by one into the brush. The pale-chinned one looked back once before disappearing, curious in the way young wild creatures were curious, with the whole world still sharp and new. Daniel remained by the window until the last branch stopped moving. He understood then that Juniper had not returned to become part of his household story. She had returned to show him hers. And somehow, that was more healing than being chosen for himself alone. After the retreat, people began asking Daniel what it had meant. They asked carefully, because most of them were kind. Veterans at the clinic leaned on the coffee table and signed slow questions. Neighbors at the parts store stopped beside the oil filters with gentle faces. Walt from the lower ranch arrived with a starter motor and a pie his wife had baked, then stood in Daniel's shed, pretending to study spark plugs while waiting for the answer to appear by itself. Daniel never had one ready. He could describe the facts. Juniper had returned. She had touched his hand. She had shown her kits. She had disappeared again into the ravine before sunset. Those were simple enough. Meaning was harder. Meaning arrived later, in quiet pieces. The first piece came the following week, when Daniel found Bobcat tracks near the creek below his cabin. They were not close to the porch. They were not an invitation. They crossed the frozen mud at the water's edge, clean and round, moving from the young pines toward the stone ledge where rabbits often passed. Two smaller sets of prints followed in wandering lines, sometimes neat, sometimes foolish. One kit had stepped into the other S-track and ruined the pattern. Another had slid slightly on ice and left a long, undignified scrape. Daniel crouched there in the blue morning light, breath clouding in front of him. He did not call out. He did not follow. He only smiled with his mouth closed, the way a man smiled when the world had trusted him with a secret it did not want, repeated loudly. The cabin became different after that, though not in ways guests noticed immediately. Daniel stopped thinking of the porch as a place animals might come to be fed. He thought of it as an edge. His life ended there in one direction. The forest began in another. The best love knew the line and swept snow from it anyway. He left no bowls outside, except when Dr. Klein asked him to help with official scent checks far from the house. He secured trash in the shed. He warned neighbors not to leave scraps for anything wild, even when they nodded as if he were being dramatic. He installed a small trail camera near the lower creek, angled away from the cabin, and checked only once a week, not to spy, but to know whether the family was passing safely. The camera caught them twice that winter. Once, Juniper crossed at dusk, a low shadow moving through blue snow, her notched ear clear in the frame. Behind her came the darker Kit, carrying something that looked like a twig and behaving as though it had captured greatness. The pale-chinned Kit pounced at its sibling S-tail and then pretended to inspect a rock when Juniper turned around. Daniel watched the short silent clip 3 times, then closed the laptop before wanting became too hungry. Another time, the camera recorded only Juniper's face close to the lens. One amber eye, half a whisker line, pale crescent at the muzzle, and then the blurry shape of her cheek as she rubbed against the device and pushed it crooked. When Daniel showed Dr. Klein, she wrote, "Technical review. Bobcat disapproves of surveillance." Daniel wrote back, "Surveillance deserved it." Elise laughed so hard that coffee nearly came out her nose, which improved the afternoon for everyone except Elise. Spring came slowly. Snow shrank back from the fence posts. Meltwater ran under the culvert where Daniel had first found Juniper. The juniper bushes darkened and loosened their scent under warmer sun. At the clinic, the retreat group returned once a month, not to see Juniper, because Dr. Klein made that boundary firm, but to walk, repair, share lunch, and be quiet together in a place where silence no longer felt like failure. Daniel helped build a new observation blind well away from the ravine. Paul painted the inside with steady hands. Tessa installed signs explaining respectful distance. Milo and Noah helped sand a bench, though Milo sanded one corner so enthusiastically it became visibly smaller than the rest. Daniel ran his hand over the uneven edge and wrote in his notebook, "Custom ergonomic feature." Milo bowed. Those small warmths settled into the place. Amos, now too old to jump onto the copier, claimed a padded basket beneath the front desk and accepted visitors as if they had traveled solely to admire him. May retired from full-time ranger work, but still came by with maps and strong opinions. Dr. Klein kept the yellow pan on the shelf, where it became a sort of private museum piece. Someone stuck a small paper crown on it. No one confessed. At home, Daniel's family visited more often without making an event of it. Elise brought fewer oranges, finally accepting that 6 was not an emergency minimum. Noah grew tall enough to duck under the shed door and helped replace brake pads. Milo learned more sign and used it with dramatic seriousness, signing Bobcat Queen every time a track appeared in mud. Daniel no longer sat at the kitchen table as if waiting for the room to give back what it had taken. He cooked sometimes. Badly, but sincerely. He kept the blue blanket folded over the chair, not as a wound now, but as a witness. On cold evenings, he wore his hearing aids until he grew tired, then set them beside the salt shaker without anger. The quiet remained. It had simply changed company. One April evening, just after sunset, Daniel stood on the porch with Elise, while peepers called from the wet ground below the creek. He could not hear them well, but Elise described the sound "ve kepite hat" wiggling fingers, and an expression so silly that he understood enough. The air smelled of thawed soil and wood smoke. Far down by the stone ledge, a tawny shape moved between alder shadows. Juniper paused only once. She did not come closer. Her kits, larger now, slipped behind her like two pieces of dusk, learning their own paths. Daniel raised his hand, palm open, not asking, not holding. Juniper looked toward the cabin. Then she turned into the trees. Elise touched his sleeve. "You okay?" Daniel watched the branches settle. He nodded, and this time the answer was true. The cabin had not become a place where Juniper stayed. It had become a place she could pass without fear. For Daniel, that was enough to live by. Years settled over Tamarack Ridge with the quiet patience of moss on stone. Daniel grew older in ways the mountains seemed to understand. His beard whitened first along the chin, then at the edges. His bad hip stiffened before storms. His hands remained steady, though he took longer tehat small screws and sometimes held parts closer to the lamp. The cabin roof needed patching twice. The wood stove finally received a new door handle after Elise threatened to replace the entire stove with something less stubborn than its owner. Daniel wrote in his notebook, "Impossible product category." Elise laughed, but she watched him more closely after that. Juniper remained part of the land, not part of the household. That difference became sacred. Some seasons, Daniel saw no sign of her for months. Other times, tracks crossed the creek mud after rain, or a camera caught a tawny shoulder passing through alder shade. The kits grew into separate lives. The darker one appeared one autumn on the far ridge, broad and confident, with a torn-looking tuft of fur on one cheek. The pale-chinned one vanished from Daniel's knowing entirely, which May said was usually good news for a bobcat. Being unseen is survival, she told him, facing him carefully. Daniel carried that sentence for a long time. The blue blanket wore thin at the fold. He no longer kept it on the kitchen chair every day. Sometimes it lay in a cedar chest. Sometimes Milo, nearly grown and too tall for his own elbows, pulled it out when visiting and wrapped it around his shoulders while drinking cocoa like he had not become a young man. Noah called him dramatic. Milo signed Bobcat Queen with one hand from inside the blanket, and Daniel shook his head as if disappointed in the entire next generation. Warmth lived there now, without needing to announce itself. The cabin no longer held its breath after people left. It exhaled. There were boots by the door in winter, spare mugs on the shelf, a hook by the stove where Elise hung her red scarf when she stayed for supper. Daniel hosted the retreat veterans twice a year for a repair day, though everyone knew half the repairs could have waited. Paul sharpened tools with the solemnity of a priest. Tessa organized lunch, labels, and people with equal skill. Amos had been gone by then, buried beneath a flat stone near the clinic lilacs, but Dr. Klein still blamed him whenever turkey disappeared from a sandwich. The yellow pan remained on the clinic shelf until the paint flaked from its rim. No one used it. No one threw it away. Juniper grew harder to see as the years passed. Her appearances became briefer, farther, more like messages left in weather than visits. Daniel accepted that with an ache that no longer frightened him. He had learned that love did not always ask to be fed by proof. Sometimes it lived on the memory of one silent head bump in falling snow, and on the discipline of leaving the forest uncalled. One late winter evening, when Daniel was 60, the mountain gave him one last clear sight of her. The day had been mild, with snow melting from the porch roof in slow drops that darkened the boards. The air smelled of wet cedar and thawing earth, though the creek still held ice along its edges. Daniel had spent the afternoon repairing a neighbor's old generator and had come home tired, oil on his sleeve and a dull ache in his hip. He made coffee in the chipped brown mug, then changed his mind and poured most of it out. The evening was too still to spend inside. He stepped onto the porch and stood with one hand on the repaired rail. The sky above Cabinet Mountain had turned rose-gray. Down near the creek, alders made black lace against the snow. For a long while, nothing moved except meltwater dripping from the eaves. Then she appeared. Juniper stood on the stone ledge beyond the creek, older than any memory he had kept of her, and somehow exactly herself. Her coat looked paler around the muzzle. The notch in her ear remained. The crescent near her whiskers showed faintly when she turned her head. She was leaner now, her movements slower, but the line of her body still belonged wholly to the wild. Daniel did not step off the porch. He did not call her name. He only lifted one hand, palm open. Juniper looked toward him across the blue distance of evening. Snowmelt ticked from the roof behind him. Somewhere under the bank, the creek worked softly beneath ice. Daniel felt the quiet settle around his shoulders, not as absence, but as recognition. He signed thank you. His fingers moved slowly, but clearly. Juniper lowered her head, not to him exactly, but to the world between them. She brushed her cheek against a young pine at the edge of the ledge, leaving her invisible mark as she had always done. Then she sat for a moment, facing the cabin, amber eyes steady in the fading light. Daniel's own eyes filled, but he smiled through it. At last, Juniper rose and turned toward the trees. She disappeared without drama, as wild things often did, not leaving because she cared less, not staying because he cared more. She simply moved where her life led her. Daniel remained on the porch until the shadows joined and the ledge became part of the dark. Only then did he go inside, place the chipped mug in the sink, and fold the blue blanket once more across the back of the kitchen chair. Not because he was waiting, because some things deserved a place. The porch light burned low that night, soft against the old boards Daniel had repaired with his own hands. Beyond the cabin, the creek moved under its skin of ice, and the pines leaned together as if sharing a secret too quiet for people to hear. The flat stone by Juniper's first fence was long buried under seasons. The orange on the guardrail had become only a family joke. The yellow pan sat in retirement at the clinic, still ridiculous, still beloved. And the blue blanket, thinned by years, held the memory of a frightened young bobcat, a patient man, a storm, a loss, and a return no one could have forced. Juniper had never belonged to Daniel. That was why the story stayed beautiful. She had come close only when closeness was her choice. She had left when the ridge called her. She had returned not as a pet, not as a promise, but as a living answer from the wild. And Daniel, who had once feared silence meant being left outside the world, learned that some of the deepest words arrived without sound. A paw in snow, a slow blink, a cheek against a cedar post, a silent head bump against an open hand. So let the cabin grow dim now. Let the repaired porch step cool beneath the stars. Let the old veteran rest with the window, cracked just enough for pine-scented air to enter. Somewhere beyond the creek, perhaps only in memory, a notched ear turned once toward the light, before vanishing into the dark. Thank you for staying with this quiet story until the end. May the animals who once changed your heart visit your dreams gently tonight. May your own silences feel less lonely. Sleep peacefully, and let the snow keep falling where the forest remembers. End of story. Sleep gently, friends.